my 1965 house. But I just wanted to set the stage really quickly before, because really the show is Dawn, as you all know. But I wanted to set the stage a little bit about why the Conservancy undertook this effort and brought Don and his team on to do this study. Initially came about through our 40th anniversary and wanting to have a database study that would demonstrate and illustrate the benefits of preservation in Los Angeles. We had long wanted to have something like that. And while anecdotally we know that preservation benefits the lives and livability of people that live in older and historic places, we didn't have the substantive, quantitative, qualitative data to really make that case. And so we brought Don on, and admittedly we threw the kitchen sink at him in terms of we wanted to look at everything. We started with the idea of looking at economics and property values, which there's been a number of studies across the country looking at that. But we also wanted to look at the hard issues and the issues that often trip us up in terms of preservation and some of the critiques of preservation. So we wanted to get at issues of gentrification, displacement, affordable housing, certainly density, cultural diversity, and sustainability, as well as initially we had wanted to look at the nexus between filming in a place like Los Angeles and California and historic places. And for various reasons, we weren't really able to delve very much into that one. But LA is unique, especially when you're doing a study like this, in part because we know where our historic assets are, thanks to Survey LA and the city's survey. So we know what we have and what's designated, and we know that there's a lot of room available for growth and development. Having said that, there's still a lot of arguments and concerns about, certainly from the YIMBY, NIMBY side around housing and density, and these are pressure points that we really wanted to address and look at through this study about how do we both retain and produce affordable housing. At the same time, how do we increase density and do it in a way that's sensitive to older and historic places? And thankfully, Don and again and his team, we're really fortunate to have them look at this and take this on. I also want to thank, just at the start, this takes a village to do a study like this. So we had many donors that stepped up very quickly in support of this study. And so I want to thank them all. Some of you are tuning in today, so we could not have done this without your help, and really appreciate that. And the last point I just wanted to leave with before turning this over to Don is that at the Conservancy, we don't want to just do a study and leave it at that. So we're planning to take this study and really craft an action agenda to come from this, and really use it to implement new policies, hopefully tweak existing policies, but really use it to inform and educate us as we move forward with this study. But that's kind of the prelude of why we wanted to do this study and what came from it. And there were some surprises along the way, and it's a I think very good study for us in terms of informing preservation in Los Angeles, but we see it having much bigger lessons learned in terms of throughout California, but nationally as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Don. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. Hello, everyone. Thanks for signing in. I'm at home in downtown Washington, D.C. I live downtown, exactly halfway between the White House and the Capitol building. And I've lived here for 20 years, and nobody from either of those places ever stopped by our apartment to ask what I thought, but maybe this is the chance. So we loved, I got to thank Adrian and Linda Dishman and the Conservancy for letting us do this, because nobody on my team was California native. And so we both learned a lot about LA and very candidly got to really like Los Angeles that I don't think any of us were necessarily predisposed to do before we began the study. So we, as Adrian said, we cast a very wide net of things to look at. And then when we learn things, we've kind of bundled them into some characteristics of the attributes of historic preservation in Los Angeles. It allows room to grow, it's affordable, it's diverse, it's dense, it's stable, it's cost effective, it's sustainable, and it's an economic driver. And I'll give you some factoids, some of the things we learned in each of those areas. But starting with just the basics. About 80% of the Los Angeles buildings, everyone thinks of Los Angeles as a new city, but 80% of the buildings are more than 50 years old. But nobody's claiming that everything over 50 years deserves the title of being historic in some designated fashion. There's about 1,200 historical cultural monuments, 35 historic preservation overlay zones that most of the rest of the country just calls local preservation districts. There's 26 National Register districts, 195 individual National Register properties. About 3% of the population lives in those HPOZs, the local historic districts, and about 1.8% of the jobs are in the preservation districts. So we started out on comparing what was the kind of construction activity in the HPOZs, have regulation, have design review, have a whole bunch of characteristics, and the rest of the city. And in terms of kind of general patterns, there's not that much difference. There's a greater share of rehabilitation, as one would expect in the historic areas. And there's a smaller share of demolition when you look at the permits by count. But when you look at permits by dollars expended, I think that some interesting things come up. First of all, almost half of the money, 44% of the money that's spent in construction in historic districts is on rehabilitation. But, you know, Ken Bernstein from the Preservation Office in Los Angeles, and he and his staff were great help in prepared this, he's always had his kind of set of myths about preservation. And one of them has always been, well, those historic districts are just frozen in place. They're like three-dimensional museums, and they're just stuck. Well, that's clearly not true. That 22% of the money spent on construction in historic districts was, in fact, in new construction, and another 34% spent on additions to existing structures. So far from being kind of frozen in place, these are very dynamic, changing, and evolving neighborhoods, but with the changes that are made really being considerate of the context within which they exist. And then the issue about, well, historic preservation commission, they're in the business of saying no. Well, that just simply is not true. Is that on the average, we looked at 10 years worth of decisions by the various, in Los Angeles, there's a variety of preservation commissions that oversee the design review in various neighborhoods, an average about 420 where people applied because they were doing work on their existing structure, another 100 on non-contributing structures in those zones, certificates of appropriate, certificates of compatibility, accessory dwelling units, of which there's been almost 100 in the last couple of years. Now, I know that you all signed in so that I could spend an hour and 15 minutes explaining this curve. And it's the revealed preference analysis. And here's what that means, is that we could have stated preference. That is, we do a poll and you say what you like, and for this, I'm against that, and for this candidate, against that candidate. That's stated preference. Or we can do it by what's called revealed preference, in that we decide what you like or don't like based on your actions in the marketplace. So think of it, instead of that graph, think of it this way. If we were back in the days where we could have a meeting of all of us in a single room, we could bring in a tray of ice cream cones. And instead of asking you each, do you like chocolate or vanilla better, all of you would take one of the cones. And by your actions, I chose a vanilla cone or I chose a chocolate cone, we have revealed our preference between those two. And so much of our analysis, our approach in these studies and in Los Angeles was the revealed preference of the marketplace for historic district, historic neighborhoods. So in the big scope, you know, again, Preservation Office says, geez, you know, you're just stopping development of our whole city. You're freezing it all in place. Well, in fact, that's not remotely true. That of all of the parcels, the individual lots in the city of Los Angeles, 2.8% are currently designated under the purview of the landmarks commissions. Another 3.5% were identified by the survey L.A. As potentially eligible to be listed, leaving 94% of all of the parcels and about 2% of all the land area that's neither currently designated nor identified as appropriate for designated. So huge amounts, vast majority of the city. In fact, developers, builders, whomever can do whatever they damn well please, not under the purview of preservation ordinances. Well, another one of the big myths is that historic districts they're fine for kind of rich white people, but they're in fact not affordable. Well, in fact, the opposite has been true. As many of you have been involved in this very critical issue of affordable housing, and it's an issue that affects everybody around the country. One of the measurements that's emerged in recent years is that housing affordability is not just how much your rent or your mortgage payment is, but also what your transportation costs are. So in the language of the housing affordability, it's called the H+T index, how much you spend on housing plus transportation. And to be affordable, that needs to be under 50% of your income. Well, in fact, on the housing plus transportation index, historic preservation overlay zones in Los Angeles, in fact, are decidedly lower for families. A far greater share of households in the HPOZs, in fact, are under the affordability link than they are in the rest of the city. And part of that is driven by the rents. Now, every place is becoming expensive, and Los Angeles is particularly expensive. But when we looked at average rent for studio apartments by age, there's a little kind of premium paid for the pre-1920 apartments. And then what happens is that the older the unit, the more affordable it is. Every decade that goes up, in fact, the rent for that unit is more expensive. And then when we looked at those among us who are in most need, those who are at 80% of the average median area median income, in fact, it's greater share of affordability for both a two-person household and a four-person household in the properties in historic preservation overlay zones than in the rest of the city. So far being it from it pricing everybody out, in fact, these neighborhoods are more affordable overall. You know, this issue of gentrification, and it's always told, almost always told in the anecdote. My Aunt Martha couldn't afford to live in the neighborhood anymore, so she had to move out. But a couple years ago, there's a really, really good study by scholars in Los Angeles that identified on a very sophisticated way the neighborhoods in Los Angeles that were gentrifying. Gentrified areas over a 15-year period, and those are what are on in orange on your left of your screen. So we took their map of gentrified areas and overlaid the historic preservation overlay zones. And it's not that there's no connection, but there's almost none. In fact, you see in outline form where those historic preservation zones, there's very little correlation between the areas that are identified as gentrifying and the historic districts. So gentrification may or may not be a real thing, and I suspect it is, but to identify that historic preservation is the cause of it is just factually incorrect. They're also diverse. Again, one of these myths that historic districts for the rich white people. In fact, a greater share of Latinos, Hispanics live in a historic district than live in the city as a whole. When you look at the whole range of race and ethnicity in Los Angeles, a greater share of Asian, a greater share of Black, and a greater share of other. And other would be both Native American, South Pacific, but also mixed race peoples who identify themselves as other, a greater share of them than the city as a whole. The group that's underrepresented relative to their share of the population of the whole of the city is in fact the white population in Los Angeles. That's 51% of the city, but only 37% of the population in the historic districts. It's also diverse by age. So here's the lines. The orange line is the age distribution in the city of Los Angeles. The blue line is the distribution by age of people living in historic preservation zones. And they're almost identical curves, except for this. In fact, there's a greater propensity for people in that kind of millennial age group living in historic districts than live in the city as a whole, but there's good reason for that. The National Association of Realtors has a really great research unit And one of the things that they do regularly is do a generational study of who buys houses. It's a realtors organization, and they want to look at who's buying their houses. Well, in their last national study, 34% of all home buyers were millennials. 44% of the buyers of houses built between 1912 and 1960 were millennials, and 59% of people who bought houses built prior to 1912 were millennials. And we think it's driven by this 3 C's: by the character of the house in the neighborhood, by the cost of the house, and of the convenience of where those historic neighborhoods are located. And then when we look at the income charts, again, when you go to the far left, the ones with more modest income, households with income less than $25,000, that makes up 25% of all households in Los Angeles, almost 30% of the households that live in historic districts. That's true in the 25 to 50. At the 50 to 75, it's about a statistical toss-up. Then in the next 3 groups, in fact, a greater share of the wealthy live in the city than live in the historic districts. And then when you get the highest end of incomes, it's about a toss-up. So once again, there is, not only is it skewed toward the rich, it's really skewed the other way. It's more affordable or accommodating more people of modest incomes than the city as a whole. It's also dense. Again, density is really an interesting thing, is that, you know, transportation planners, urban planners, engineers, public health people, everybody says we have to have dense cities, and everybody wants density except citizens will say, I don't want density. If I want density, I'd live in Manhattan. But in fact, lots of things depend on density. But and often historic districts are saying, hey, you stupid historic districts, you're keeping us from being a dense place. Well, in fact, not true. In historic preservation overlay districts in Los Angeles, the average density in those areas is nearly twice the average density in the rest of the residential areas of the city of Los Angeles. And then lots of discoveries we had when we looked at how land is zoned. In fact, a lot larger share of the historic preservation overlay zones are zoned residential than the city as a whole, about 80% of them. Part of that, and we'll come back to it, is that in Los Angeles, unlike many other cities, there are very few local historic districts that are commercial. The vast majority of them are residential. And so you end up, not surprisingly, with a large share of the land zoned residential. But you take a step further and look at the land that's zoned exclusively single family, it's about a toss-up between the city as a whole and the historic preservation zones. And then some interesting kind of contrasts between what's true in historic preservation overlay zones and what's true in the rest of the city. So the average age, median age, 1929, the historic preservation overlay zones, 1957, the rest of the city. A really important one, 2,000 average square foot in the properties in the historic zone, 3,000 in the rest of the city. Now, nothing wrong with somebody preferring a bigger house, but if we want density, if we want to accommodate 1 and 2 family households, and that's 65% of all the population, in fact, we need smaller units, not larger units. And then the differences remain about the same, except for the improvement value. The land's a toss-up, the dollars per square foot is about a toss-up. The average value of the improvements is where it makes a difference, where in fact, newer neighborhoods are more expensive. This density, both because of who lives there and also the location of those places, means that transit ridership, and Los Angeles has recognized that they really need to up their game in terms of public transport. The transit ridership is significantly greater in historic districts than in other areas. And then that also means there's room to grow. Now, most of you listening in are from California, although I heard that 22 different states are represented, so you're all welcome. But for those of you from not California, in the last couple of years, the state legislature has passed a law at the state level that basically precludes municipalities from saying there can't be any additional dwelling units on a residential lot. basically have to open it up to allow people to add these second units in single family zone areas. Well, it's interesting, and I have to credit preservationists in Los Angeles. In much of the country, preservationists have really fought this, said, oh no, it's going to wreck our historic districts. Well, in Los Angeles, they said, hey, this is fait accompli, nothing we can do about it. But the good news is that at least in historic neighborhoods, we can control the character, the scale, the quality of what's built as those auxiliary dwelling units. Well, we looked at all of the single family properties in the HPOZs. About 40%, about a third of them have less than 40% lot coverage, meaning there could be about 3,400 more units that are accommodated on those areas. And again, with some influence on the character, quality, scale, setback of what those units look like. But here was really a cool finding. And again, we wouldn't have thought it, and it was Linda and Adrian that said, you ought to take a look at this. We looked at strip malls in the city of Los Angeles, and you all know them. Well, turns out that there's 675 of them. They consume 24 million square feet of ground, but 7.2 million square feet of leasable area, meaning 2/3 of the space in those strip centers is for cars, not for businesses. On average, it's 10,700 square foot building on a 35,000, 36,000 square foot piece of land. So we made the calculation that if those were all rezoned, so you could accommodate 4 or 5 story structures, you could build new buildings, provide all of space for all of the businesses that are currently there, plus adds more than 63,000 apartment units in those areas, plus people still need cars, plus 1 parking space for every unit. So if we need to add a whole bunch of density, here's where 63,000 studio apartments could be added. Back to that issue about lots of it zoned residential, but not so much zoned single family residential. Well, that has paid off in terms of the variety of housing and the cost of the housing and the other characteristics, is that in the city as a whole, in the residential areas, 85% of it is single family residence. In the historic neighborhoods, only 31% is single family residence. So you have duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and 5 or more units. So you have the whole range of housing options added in those historic neighborhoods. That's what adds to density. That's what adds to diversity. That's what adds to affordability. Also, though, there's this issue about stability. And again, nationwide, just short of 2/3 of the people own their house, about a little more than a third rent. Well, those ratios are almost reversed in Los Angeles, where 38% are owners, 62% are renters. And in the historic preservation overlay zones, the ratio of ownership is even less, meaning 2 things. One, that they are accommodating more renters, but it can also have the risk of saying, well, but those places that are dominated by renters, they tend to be not such stable neighborhoods, because renters are always coming and going, and so you don't build up that sense of stability and permanence with predominantly renter neighborhoods. Well, lo and behold, not true. That in fact, the people who moved in 20 years ago or more, a greater share of the residents in historic neighborhoods moved in 20 years ago or more than in the rest of the city, but even more so in terms of long-term renters. The share of renters that moved in more than 10 years ago, 43% in historic neighborhoods versus 38% in the rest of the city, and people moved in more than 20 years ago, 16.5% in historic preservation overlay zones, 14%. So what you have is, while a lower share of home ownership, in fact, you have a larger pattern of long-term residents leading to neighborhood stability. It's also cost effective. Again, the kind of mythology that nobody can afford to do that historic preservation stuff is just too expensive. Well, just not so. So we compared a couple of things. We compared what the average cost for projects in Los Angeles that use the historic preservation tax credit. And then we looked at building permits of new construction, of comparable quality new construction. Well, the numbers themselves on a per square foot basis were about the same But where the tax credit projects included both hard and soft costs, and soft costs usually run someplace between 25 and 35% of the cost of a whole project. In fact, the building permits only apply to hard costs. So when you add them together, in fact, the preservation projects were more cost effective than equivalent quality new construction. And of course, in Los Angeles, there are some good tools that help make it more cost effective. There is the federal rehabilitation tax credit that we can also use. There is the recently passed California historic tax credit. Now, I'll tell you, it's not large enough. It's not an annual amount big enough, but step in the right direction. The Mills Act has been used around 3,500 properties in Los Angeles, an effective tool on the property tax basis. Los Angeles has a very effective adaptive reuse ordinance that they really pioneered for the entire world. It's one that's cited around the world on kind of effective tools. And then in California, the seismic retrofit cost recovery program. So smart developers who's willing to kind of have the patience to treat historic properties right have a variety of tools that can be brought to bear. Then there's the issue about the Sustainable Development Goals. You know that in 2016, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and for the first time, cultural resources were included. But one of the key SDGs is number 11, which is making cities sustainable, means creating career and business opportunities, safe and affordable housing, and building resilient societies and economies. Well, that's what historic preservation is doing in Los Angeles. Now, Los Angeles is better than many places around the country about capturing some of the demolition debris that otherwise would just go into the landfill. But just for an understanding, you demolish a small house in Los Angeles, 2,000 square foot, modest sized house. In fact, that generates almost 300 cubic yards of debris for the landfill, 84 tons worth of junk is permanently going into the Los Angeles landfill. The other kind of major environmental side of sustainability is tree cover. And again, great study done in Los Angeles of where the tree cover was. And there's almost a perfect correlation between the older the neighborhood, the more likely there is to be significant tree coverage. As neighborhoods are filled with newer houses, often means tearing down trees. In fact, the tree cover goes down. And then preservation neighborhoods as an economic driver. Again, in Los Angeles, has a smaller share of historic districts that are commercial districts. Only 1.8% of the jobs are in historic neighborhoods. But look at the rates, even in spite of that, look at the rates of job growth. The city as a whole, over the last decade for which there was data, jobs in the city as a whole grew about 15%, grew about 25% in historic preservation overlay zones, and 55% in National Register districts. And here's the difference. While there's not many local districts that are commercial districts, there's quite a few commercial National Register districts, and you're seeing the payoff of people expressing their revealed preference for being in those neighborhoods. Now, you can love Los Angeles or you can hate Los Angeles, but nobody can argue that it's not one of the great arts and culture cities in the world. Well, the growth in those industries, almost twice as much in the historic preservation overlay zones as in the rest of the city. And then the knowledge workers. Many of you read or heard about Richard Florida. He's kind of 70% brilliant and 30% head in a dark place. And he's talked about the creative class, and we look at that. But we like to combine that with kind of knowledge workers. And between those two, kind of creative class workers and knowledge workers, while there never be a giant share of any city's employment base, they're really important share because they kind of lead the way in a whole lot of other areas. So you look at 1.8% of all the jobs in historic districts, 2.5% in real estate, 2.9% in healthcare, 3% in services, 3% in finance insurance, 3.3% in administration, all knowledge worker jobs with a revealed preference to be in historic districts. Even more important, this issue of startup jobs. Businesses are just getting going. Again, historic neighborhoods have 1.8% of all jobs, but 4% of all the startup jobs in the city of Los Angeles. And then this is one that has, of course, two sides of the knife on this, and that is the change in value over time. And so we looked over a 20-year period, 15-year period at the change in value on a per square foot basis between what's happening in historic preservation overlay zones and the rest of the city. And what happened in Los Angeles is exactly the same that we've seen every place we've looked. That in good times, historic properties and historic districts go up faster. In bad times, they go down slower and less. And in recovery times, they resume their pattern. And so over the 15-year period, the change in value of those historic neighborhoods, in fact, just significantly exceeded the city as a whole. And then looking at just older stuff in the office building side of things is that of all, and again, this is not limited to in historic districts, but we looked at all buildings built prior to 1950, so stuff that's now 70 years old. Well, that constitutes 37% of all office space, but 45% in the creative loft space, 50%, 49% in the office live work space, and 68% of the industrial live work. So once again, the marketplace is revealing their preferences for those kind of cutting edge activities, live workspace, both in office and industrial and creative law space, kind of cutting edge across those industries, preference for older buildings. And then we looked at vacancy. And once again, in terms of office building in general or loft creative spaces, in fact, the lower vacancy is in those older buildings. Once again, marketplace expressing, revealing its preference. So the conclusion of all this is that there is in historic districts in Los Angeles, there's room to grow. They're affordable, they're more affordable, they're diverse, they're more diverse, they're stable, they're dense, they're cost effective, they're sustainable, and they're an economic driver. So in the end, preservation is positive for the city and the people of Los Angeles in lots of directions. So we're looking forward to your questions. And once again, thanks for being with us today.
Great. Thank you, Don. Chris and I can field the questions here. We have a lot of questions, so get ready but to both of our panelists. And please feel free to continue to ask questions. So while I'm getting this sort of managed, Chris, did you have a question you wanted to field from the group?
Yeah, well, first I wanted to thank both of you. That's a great presentation. And I was writing down some notes, and you had mentioned, Don, that it was 295 cubic yards just from a 2,000 square foot house. And I thought it was interesting to note that that is actually 15 20-yard dumpsters. So you think of these, dumpsters with back and forth, and that's also a very disturbing part of construction and the tear downs in these neighborhoods. You'll go in some neighborhoods in Los Angeles, it's just dumpster after dumpster after dumpster, and it just circulates for years as they cycle through a neighborhood. Do you have any observations on that?
Well, only you can't claim to be environmentally responsible and still just be indifferent to demolition taking place, whether it's historic or not. We just can't. I mean, every fourth grader in America learns that being environmentally responsible is reuse, repair, recycle. Well, when we're using our historic buildings, we're doing that. And we're tearing down, we're not doing any of those. So don't let some environmentalists say, yeah, for the environment, we got to throw away those old buildings. They're lying, or they're ignorant, one or the other.
Mm-hmm. I can read another question, John, and I think you have some people raising their hands, but I'll go ahead with another one. With dense living, this is from Anonymous, with dense living being a factor in the spread of disease, will pushing building skyscrapers as housing continue to be a popular form of development in your mind? Well,
that's a good question. And that lots of people are trying to ponder that in the last 2 months. But here's what I think is really important. I would argue that there's lots of components of urban life that require density. But I think what we're going to learn from this virus and that kind of thing is we really need to have not just density, but density at a human scale. And that's what our historic neighborhoods are doing. They're providing density, but in fact, they're doing it in fashions other than 50-story condominiums. They're doing it at a human scale, even though they're more dense than the city as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, I also have enabled Susan's voice, and she had a question. She was raising her hand, so maybe she can ask that right now, hopefully if her microphone is working.
Yes, thank you. I hear you. And toward the beginning, you said something about that the historic preservation zones were only representing about 3% of the city, so there is plenty of room to grow. The problem I see, though, as I drive around, is that there are many neighborhoods that are all historic houses, all like, 60, 100 years old or more, and yet they're not officially preserved, and they're just considered disposable, and the owners don't care about them at all, and so they go, or they get replaced one by one till the whole neighborhood is ruined. So they're not officially preserved, but they're still historic. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And Adrian may want to weigh in on this as well. But I think that's why we included in those numbers both the neighborhoods that are currently under designation of some kind, plus the neighborhoods that were identified by the Getty-funded Los Angeles survey. And I would expect that many of those neighborhoods that you're talking about would have been identified as ones that ought to be designated. So I would think that Adrian can speak for the Conservancy, but that one of the outcomes of this is say, we could designate those things, or many of those identified in the Survey LA process, and give that protection to more neighborhoods, still without kind of encumbering the city, casting a preservation net over the whole thing.
Yeah, I would disagree and add to that, Don. Thanks for the question, Susan. You're right. There are many neighborhoods throughout LA, and this is emblematic of so many communities across the country that are older and historic and eligible, but not yet protected in any way. And those are the neighborhoods where you're seeing a lot of damage occur. So little by little, they're getting eroded away in terms of, after a period of time, they may no longer be eligible unless we intervene or put in place some tools or incentives to try to ensure preservation. And HPOZ is, it's great. It's a great tool for Los Angeles, and we have 35 of them, but we have many other neighborhoods that are eligible, and we need to figure out, are there other policies, other approaches that are maybe more streamlined, more effective, quicker to help these neighborhoods? Because in many ways, we're at a race against development, and those neighborhoods are seeing the brunt of it.
Is my mic still on?
Yep.
I just as an addendum, being involved in trying to go downtown to City Council and to the Cultural Heritage Commission and say these things, I've noticed lately in recent years that the standards are getting so high for designations that now it's not enough just to be in perfect condition and 100 years old. It has to be like someone famous lived there or some famous architect built it. And so I'm losing the battle a lot lately, because they're just like, well, so what? It's beautiful and has character. That doesn't matter. What is its, in other words, the standards are so high now, I feel like we can't get things designated the way the atmosphere is right now. It's been my experience going downtown. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Don, did you want to take that? I had something to say actually about that, Susan, was that I agree with you. I've been finding that a lot of people are having problems getting their buildings on the National Register or designated in some way, because I feel like the bar has risen in terms of both the documentation and also the historic significance. And Don and Adrian, are you hearing back from people that this has been a problem?
I'll just chime in. I mean, it's certainly a different world than we were just 10 or 15 years ago in terms of eligibility and making the case. It's much more academic than it was, in our early days in preservation, and when some of these districts came online, it was just an easier process. It's much more difficult now to do that. Even in the best of times, it's a political process. It's bringing a lot of people together, and it takes a lot of time to get the support to get a district through, especially when you're talking about multiple buildings at a time versus a single, landmark. That in itself isn't easy. But I think it does call for, as mentioned before, maybe some new approaches. Someone was asking a question, does LA have conservation districts? We don't. We've talked about it. Cities looking into it. There's the new recode, the new zoning land use policy or system for Los Angeles that's being implemented through community plans, and there's some tools in there that will help too. So I think if we're talking about preservation in the 21st century, an HPOZ or a local historic district is one of the tools, but it's not the only tool to try to achieve a preservation-based outcome, especially when we've got larger forces that we're dealing with increasing density and affordable housing, all these other things. We need to think outside the box in terms of what are other tools that can help us get there.
Thank you very much for answering the questions.
Thank you, Susan. And I'll add to that, there was a comment made about the demand for designation. Believe it or not, there's just a rampant interest in designation now, and the city, Adrian can correct me if I'm wrong or correct the commenter if he or she is wrong, but there's just a backlog of applications for HPOZs in Los Angeles, and it's just a challenge keeping up with all of the interest. So with that, I think I had another question about crime. Was crime and I think it's in the Q&A box, was crime and neighborhood safety studied while looking at these areas?
We didn't. We have in other places, but we just didn't. So I have no answer on that. Yep.
Okay, I'll ask another one then from the Q&A. This is from Laura. To what extent do you attribute the greater residential stability in HPOZs to rent control via the high percentage of renters in pre-1978 buildings versus that sense of place and neighborhood character? Or is that covered in maybe an entirely different study?
No, I think it just intuitively, I think it does. No question, with rent control units, it's a motivation to stay in your apartment longer. Likewise, the limitation on bumps in property taxes makes people own their houses longer than they otherwise would for the property tax fee. So I think the kind of uniquely California or uniquely LA in the case of the former adds to that. Having said that, these patterns, while they may be exaggerated, more manifested in Los Angeles, they're really consistent with patterns elsewhere. This issue of longer stability of both renters and homeowners is true kind of wherever we've looked, just not with the extent that was true in LA. And I think that the question was right. A good share of that for renters has to do with rent control, and for owners have to do with the kind of reluctance to turn over properties.
So with that in mind, why do you think HPOZs face such an uphill battle?
Well, Adrian's much better than I to answer from the specifically Los Angeles character or perspective, but it's certainly not unique to Los Angeles. I think that there are a number of things. In some places, maybe the kind of standards have been greater. In many cases, it's ideologically driven, sometimes by neighborhoods, sometimes by elected officials, saying we just don't want anybody telling us what the hell we can do with our property. And so that's sometimes a deterrent. Sometimes in very hot markets, there is a, well, yeah, but I can sell my house and sell it to somebody to put a 8-story condo in it, and I can make my 6 retirement out of that one sale, and I don't want any limitation. Now, if those cases are not the underlying value of the property that we saw clearly in LA, like otherwise, the underlying value of the property, in fact, has outperformed as an investment the rest of the market. It is, I don't want the kind of enhanced value. I want a speculative premium for my property. And you're going to take away, and that's right, historic districts will take away that speculative premium. And so what is driving, if what our public policy is meant to do is to reward speculators, we shouldn't have any historic districts, if that's our end. But if it's to say, let's have stable neighborhoods, let's have people who see their biggest asset, in fact, being enhanced over time, we ought to be for historic districts.
I have a question to follow on that is, I think there was a lot of interest in your comments about using strip malls as housing, and a lot of interest in how we can do that and what sort of measures we can put in place. Do you have any thoughts or ideas on what we can do to sort of encourage people to reuse older commercial buildings for not just strip malls, but just any commercial buildings for housing?
Well, I think a couple different answers on that. Now, while I'm not a general proponent of demolition, I'd argue that there's not very many of those 675 strip malls in Los Angeles that's going to be the last crusade for preservationists tying themselves to them to prevent demolition. I think that that's one that we can sacrifice as crappy zero brick and styrofoam beam buildings for more intensive. If I were the czar in Los Angeles, I would instantly rezone all of that property to be eligible for 4 or 5 story mixed use residential uses, and the marketplace will respond. There's a greater shortage of residential space than there is commercial space in Los Angeles. If you the market, I'm a believer in the marketplace. And if you allowed tomorrow all of that space to be redeveloped into 4 or 5 story buildings, it would happen the day after tomorrow. That's the first half of the question. The second is on the reuse of older commercial space that doesn't fall into that category. First of all, I think we really are seeing a pattern, not so much in the HPOZs in LA, but in National Register districts, of people figuring out great ways to do that. There's whole neighborhoods of wonderful reuse in a mixed use fashion of older commercial buildings in Los Angeles, using the Mills Act, using the federal historic tax credit, using other incentives in the adaptive reuse ordinance in Los Angeles. So I think that there's really I don't mean that every tool has been invented there that's needed, but I think is that the tools that exist are being effectively used on other kinds of older commercial buildings in LA.
All right, I guess I'll take the next one here. Here's a question from Donna Graves. Hi, Donna. I haven't talked to you for a little bit. Were there no findings in this study that represent more complex or challenging issues for historic preservation? For example, matching historic tax credits with affordable housing often presents very difficult choices for cash-strapped nonprofit developers. Meeting the Secretary of Interior standards can be impossible with the amount of funding available for affordable housing projects. Do you have any solutions or answers for that?
Well, on the study, I mean, thankfully, I think we looked at plenty of complex issues. We didn't particularly look at that one. But our little firm has been doing some different work on affordable housing just in the last week or two. And here's some, and I understand that sometimes meeting the Secretary's standards is a challenge for trying to make affordable housing units. However, a very comprehensive study. Now, this isn't just historic buildings. This is all very comprehensive study of 2,500 projects over the last 5 years that have used the low-income housing tax credit. The average per unit cost for a unit in new construction nationwide, $201,000. Average per unit cost including acquisition and redevelopment of existing buildings, $159,000. So you can create 5 units in existing buildings, 5 units of affordable housing for every 4 you can create in new construction. Now, does adding the layer of being a historic building and you have to comply with things add to that? It may be. But again, with an additional 20% worth of tax credit, you could pick up a hell of amount of that difference. Then the issue is really a surprising one to me, is that for lots of reasons, and I'm a big fan of the nonprofit sector and particularly the nonprofit affordable housing development sector, but the cost per unit created using the LITC done by nonprofits is about $80,000 a unit more than when it's done by the private sector. And the reasons for that, including the fact that often low-income housing developers add community services and other things in addition to 4 walls and a roof. But in fact, the nonprofit sector's per unit cost, developing units, using the LITC, significantly higher than when the private sector does.
Don, can I ask you a question that kind of goes on that a little bit more around the affordable housing piece of this? And this is something we've talked about before, is this idea that those are advocating for greater density affordable housing, which some might fall into the YIMBY category or not, are in some ways about housing production and building our way out of the affordable housing crisis. And I think that was a key point of this study, of looking at the retention of the existing affordable housing that we have now, and this whole argument of, I think you use another way of doing it that's sometimes referred to as kind of trickle down, that if you build more market rate, it'll free up more housing for affordable. And can you?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, it's not that more units don't have to be created. They do, no question about that. But the fact is, you're right, you cannot build, just too expensive. You cannot build your way out of the affordable housing crisis. And step one has to be, we got to keep, historic or not, we have to keep the old stuff in place. And you look at all of the affordable housing, or relatively affordable housing, that's provided by older units in Los Angeles. The vast majority, they don't have subsidies, they don't have tax credits, they don't have incentives, they don't have anything. They're just there because they're still standing, almost by definition. When you tear down an old unit of housing, you've torn down a unit of affordable housing. And what we're doing, we're tearing down what's affordable and we're building what's not. You cannot build new and rent cheap. Cannot be done. Cannot be done unless you have extraordinarily deep subsidies or you build crap. So we need to have, as a core part of the strategy, forget preservation for a minute, core part of the strategy is we've got to keep the stuff that we have already in place, that the marketplace is keeping it there, providing affordable housing. That's first step, is we got to keep what we've got before we start, tearing down stuff.
Thank you, Don. I have somebody who raised their hand, and I'm going to give it a try to unmute Fran Offenhauser. Hopefully this works. If not, Fran, oh, there you are. I think you're unmuted now, Fran.
I think the question, hi, thank you so much, both of you. And I think the question I was about to ask, Don just answered, and which is that we in California are facing a legislature that keeps trying to pile on densification in residential neighborhoods, which is completely unnecessary. And this is especially hurtful to historic neighborhoods. So I just typed in and said, can you say what you just said again? Because it's really a mantra. It's a mantra that any one of these pieces of state legislation, we have to go to war to say, you cannot tear this current affordable housing down. I don't know, Adrian, what the numbers are. I think it's something like 20,000 units we've lost in Los Angeles of affordable housing, and it's all older. So anyway, can you just, I hate to ask you to do this, but give your mantra again?
Well, you could call it, thank you for calling it a mantra. It's probably just a rant. The fact is that what older neighborhoods are doing right now, yes, we need more density, but historic neighborhoods right now are providing them. They're providing, so it's not like anti-density, we're providing density, but density at human scale, number one. Number two is that older housing, whether it's designated or not, is disproportionately carrying the load of affordability. And it's carrying the load not because of some public subsidy or something else, simply because it exists in the marketplace. Some guy owns a building and it's old, and so he's getting lower rents for it, and he's just keeping it in place. When we lose that, number three, when we lose that unit, because we're going to, densify and put up something bigger, newer, whatever, we lose those affordable units, period. And what we're replacing them with is always, 100% of the time going to be more expensive, ergo less affordable. You can't do it otherwise. You don't tear down something that's worth $80,000 and replace it with something worth 60. You tear down something worth 80 and replace it with 200. And so that cuts out a whole range of humanity who can afford to live there. You cannot build new and rent cheap without extraordinarily deep subsidies. And one of the consequences of the coronavirus is every level of government is going to be stripped short of cash. And so we're not going to have excess money to be doing stuff. So we have to step back and think, what can we do to address that need with as cost effectively as possible? And that's by keeping older stuff in circulation. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you. We're developers and we know this, and it's very hard to pound into our our legislators' heads. Yeah.
Well, you're right and they're wrong.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. I think I'm going to present one final question. And it came up again, the question of strip malls. Do you think there will be a Save the Strip Mall movement coming around?
Adrian can lead it. I'm not going to be doing it.
Thanks for punting that to me. Well, surprisingly, there are some strip malls or early development strip malls that were picked up in Survey LA, but the vast majority that Don and his team identified in the study are not those. We have a plethora of strip malls that would not qualify as being historic. Granted, they last long enough. Maybe some will make it through, but who knows? Criteria, who knows where we'll be in 20, 30, 40 years from now in terms of that. But I think getting at this issue of that Don was bringing up and that we had asked him to look at strip malls, it was really the idea of, why aren't we putting the type of development and density and housing that's being built in places where it would make sense? Most of the strip malls are in transit corridors. They're in places where you really want to see that. You can still have the retail that's there now, but have housing on top. So it just makes sense in terms of a good planning approach, but it's about targeting planning versus the way planning often happens, where it's kind of piecemeal, transactional, and it happens in places where we don't necessarily want it to occur, but that's the way it happens. And it's certainly a place like LA, there's a long history of that. So it's about targeting, but probably incentivizing that type of redevelopment strip malls where it makes sense.
Great. And with that, I'm going to briefly turn it over to Chris, but while I'm doing that and while she's talking, I'm going to type a link into the bottom of the chat box. And I encourage everybody to go to this link to leave feedback about today's programs. And Chris, did you have anything else to say?
I'm going to share my screen, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't get everything in at the beginning, so I just want to make sure that we could thank all of our sponsors and thank Adrian and Don for their time today. I had mentioned that you can become a member of CPF, and we are offering a free membership when you sign on, and you can share that with your friends and family. Also, our preservation conference is going to be all online. It's coming up May 18th through 20th, and there'll be 3 days of important content that you won't want to miss, plus some fun. We'll have a tiki time and also a Wicked Sacramento presentation. All of these you can sign up at our website. Our Preservation Design Awards nominations are now open. We did set a deadline by 2 weeks, which gives you some time to nominate one of your favorite projects or something that you've completed from your own firm. We do have some other upcoming free lectures with Alan Hess, Mike Bueller, and Barbara Lamprecht. So don't miss those. It's going all the way through the summer. And also it is Preservation Month, so we should take note of that. We're hosting one free webinar from the vault every month, and this month, maybe in honor of Adrian and I, we've decided to choose a postmodernism topic. So if you sign up on our website, you can have access to this, plus all of the extra materials. Lastly, you can contact us anytime. We're here to help you give advice, and the doctor is in. So I'm going to hand it back over there to John. Oh, he's lost. John, so you can close out. But I wanted to thank Don and Adrian again, and I asked our attendees if we should have maybe a part 2 where you can answer more questions, because we had quite a few questions that we didn't get a chance to get to.
Great. Well, thank you both. And thank you, Chris, for closing us out. I'm just going to remind people to leave feedback when you leave the room. And we look forward to seeing you at tomorrow's webinar. If you're able, visit our website to learn more about tomorrow's program. Thanks again, and have a great rest of the day.
Bye. Thank you.